Hi, welcome. I'm Jen Thompson. Casey Burkholder and I recently edited a book with Routledge called Fieldnotes in Qualitative Education and Social Science Research, Approaches, Practices, and Ethical Considerations. Today, Casey and I are talking with Bree Akesson, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Social Work at Wilfrid Laurier University, and Kearney Coupland, a doctoral candidate in geography also at Wilfrid Laurier. In their provocative chapter, When Field Notes Don't Work as Expected, the Challenges of Team Research with War-Affected Populations, Bree and Kearney discuss the reasons why their field notes didn't work with their team and how they adapted the research process in ways that did.
So, can you talk about how you take field notes?
The main kind of component of the field notes was something called an interview feedback form, which I learned from Deborah Paget, who is a wonderful qualitative researcher who I follow. And I created an interview feedback form that I've used with pretty much all of my research projects. And this interview feedback form, I'll call it the IFF for short. The IFF contains questions to ask yourself as you're interviewing families, as you're collecting data. So it asks things like, what is the mood of the participant family? What does the surrounding community look like? What does the home look like? What are the emotions that come up during the interview? What are your own emotions that come up in the interview? So that's something that I've used in my research, and I've asked my research team to also use these IFF forms as well, as a way to organize their own experiences of collecting the data and their own observations. One thing I'll note as well about field notes for me, which is really important, is to include visuals. So it's not just words written on a paper, it's also, a drawing of what the room where the interview took place looks like. So I'll oftentimes sketch out a map of, if I'm interviewing a refugee family, which was the population that we were interviewing for this chapter. We'll describe that the stove is here and the family has a couch here and the TV's here, but the house is just one small room, for example. So you kind of get a sense of the environment that the family is living in through this kind of field note process.
And so I have been using a lot of the same techniques and plan to do them more. I have just come back from doing some field work, had to come back because of COVID. And so my research design has changed significantly. So some of the questions that came up in the IFF are things that I may have asked when I was doing interviews with my research community. However, now the visuals are removed because a lot of my interviews will be over the phone. So kind of using the same kind of IFF form to then consider or to think about the moods and the feeling of the conversation instead of the actual physical observations.
The next question is, what does your chapter tell us about field notes?
So for me, in my research, the researcher's experience is really important. It's actually a part of the data. And so field notes is a way for the research team to understand what that data point looks like, to understand that experience. So I put a high value on field notes. But for the team that I was working with and that I was training, field notes didn't seem to be a priority. What was a priority for them is to do the interview, record the interview, transcribe the interview, and so forth. So it was that kind of more of the meat of the data there. So our chapter really talks about how field notes are done in different ways. People have different understandings of field notes. It's often a taken for granted assumption. And at the same time, there's not really any clear-cut way on how to train someone to do field notes. So I think our chapter brings up a lot of those kinds of interesting questions to ponder for people who might be doing research with teams, doing research with students collecting the data, and doing research in volatile, kind of uncertain settings like settings that context with refugees and displaced populations.
Add to that I do feel like the assumption with a lot of students is like it's an assignment, so there's a beginning and an end to it, whereas as researchers you may have a thought or have a reflection on that later on a few days later and include that, whereas the timeline for students or for different researchers might be kind of the time surrounding the interview or the interaction with the research participants rather than an ongoing reflection. And that's where we kind of saw through more discussion-based focus groups with the student researchers, they were really able to reflect a lot more about the experience and go back to the families that they met in discussing that with their peers rather than strictly written field notes that they could, but because they're not necessarily the people who are doing the analysis, as somebody who's working on the analysis, it's kind of like, what do they mean? And it's hard to get a sense of the family with the limited amount of field notes. I wasn't part of the research in the field at all, so all I've got is the field notes to kind of go off of to help with the analysis and with kind of sharing the information and the data that was found. So but as a researcher myself, in my first time doing field notes for my own research, I related to a lot of the issues that came up and the challenges that came up for the student researchers. And I've thought about it a lot in the last few months, kind of thinking like, oh, this is, I can relate, I get this, you're exhausted, or you just, what is the relevance in this experience, not thinking 6 months down the line where it's like, oh, I know something happened that I wanted to bring into this, but I can't quite remember what it was because I didn't write it down.
We found that the topic was just so heavy for some of the student researchers that after a 2-hour interview with a family, they just didn't want to sit and write about everything that they felt and everything that they saw, which is kind of what I'd asked them to do. I said, right after you finish the interview, go find somewhere, sit down and write it all out. And that was just something that wasn't realistic for these young people who were on the research team. So for them, like Kearney mentioned, it was a bit longer of a process where maybe a few days passed or even a month, and then they were able to reflect on the experience in a much more meaningful way.
So what should researchers know about field notes?
So field notes represent a really important data point of getting at what the researchers' engagement with the research project, their impressions, the questions that they ask, the questions that they don't ask, the things that they see and feel and hear. All of that is such an important part of research data, but we tend to undervalue it. And so I think that's something that we really need to emphasize in research. And then the last two things I'll mention are about being flexible and seeing field notes in ways that are not just handwritten notes in a notebook, copious pages and pages of notes. We need to think about kind of the flexibility of field notes and what the goal of the field notes is. If the goal is to collect valuable data on the researcher's experiences and observations, that can be done in so many different ways. It could be handwritten, of course, but it could also be typed. It can be audio recorded. It can be drawings, concept maps, and other kinds of mechanisms of expressing that experience. So that flexibility, I think, is really important. And then checking in with the research team about what works for them and what doesn't work for them, I think is important, especially when you have a large research team, when you have multiple people collecting data, checking in on the process. You want to make sure that you're methodical in how you're collecting data, but you also want to be flexible enough to take account of people's own experiences and when engaging with research.
Like, it seems like it should be an easy thing to do, but it's not easy to be diligent about taking field notes, especially as a first-time researcher. It takes a lot of discipline to do it, and I guess researchers should just know that it's not just that everyone in my, I guess not everyone, that people deal with the same issues, that it's a challenge to do them.